The entire Outlast games only superficially explain the horrendous crimes Murkoff Corporation has committed against humanity. The comics reveal the events that take place behind the closed curtains, with the colossal hierarchical evil organization of Murkoff never toppling down despite a lot of their corrupt practices being leaked. Hi folks, I'm R and welcome to the video. Regardless of the video mainly focusing on the comics, keep in mind that they closely link to the story of the games, so beware of the spoilers. With that said, let's begin. The comics are told through the perspective of two Murkoff insurance mitigation agents, Pauline Glick and Paul Marion, explaining the events happening in the background, unseen to majority of the people involved with Murkoff. They're responsible for minimizing economic fallout, controlled damage, and in other words, lowering the costs incurred due to injury, scandals, or other matters on Murkoff Corporation. The story begins with Paul Marion carrying a lot of cash, turning himself in to FBI, confessing the minimum murder of at least 14 people, 1 count of arson, and 1 kidnapping. Being severely injured, with his right eyeball hanging out of its socket, he starts confessing the atrocities he had committed while employed under the strictly covert Murkoff. On the other side of the story, Pauline Glick, being in a Murkoff rehabilitation center, recovering from visible injuries that are not explained, is approached by some people working for Murkoff, asking her to help with Paul Marion's situation, who has gone rogue, intending to expose them for the inhumane organization that they are. Pauline, being very good at her job and somehow always managing to mitigate scandals and damage having become public knowledge, agrees to inform them about Paul and where he could possibly be. That's when both Paul and Pauline's stories overlap, with Paul exposing them and Pauline trying to protect them, going back some time to 2008. As soon as Glick and Marion partner up, Murkoff puts them on a case to investigate a series of murders connected to each other, labeled as the Hatbox Murders. Seemingly an American called Omar, having Egyptian grandparents, was penned for the murders, who was accused of targeting American veterans, who himself attended a psychotherapy clinic specializing in assisting veterans suffering from PTSD, which could explain that Omar himself served in the American Army. The victims were all dismembered, with their heads being missing, all being patients of Spindletop Psychotherapy Clinic. Murkoff had found a third victim, being a veteran called Martin Belmont. The clinic was acquired by Murkoff 2 years prior as part of a non-profit, after signing a contract with the government to help returning veterans with PTSD. The chief psychotherapist in the clinic wasn't directly under Murkoff management, therefore, Paul and Pauline faced difficulty obtaining information from him due to patient-doctor confidentiality. However, he explains that he conducted several experimental therapeutical practices, with the latest one being a sleep hypnosis therapy, showing remarkable results, diminishing negative thoughts and substance abuse. The psychotherapist even decorated his office with Sumerian statues and artifacts in order to associate Middle Eastern and Western cultures together, so that the veterans can find some similarity with the people they saw as villains when at war, so they can assimilate easier back in a diverse society. Being stonewalled by the therapist, refusing to give them any personal information about the patients, they go directly to the security office, being directed to someone in the surveillance room, dubbed as the Strong Fat, a man with large stature who was employed as a military police in the army. Strong Fat explains how he is assigned with observing not only the patients but also the therapists, being directed by Murkoff, something that the therapists themselves don't even know. Strong Fat, without much hesitation, gives Paul and Pauline all the tapes, allowing them to investigate further. The tapes include the sessions of several patients, 3 being the victims of Hatbox Murders, with another being Omar, who had a lot of bottled up problems, which show in one of his sessions when he loses control. Strong Fat proudly shows himself on one of the tapes, intercepting him and handling him easily due to being strong and big. After some time and visiting one of the victims' families, they go back to the therapist, Dr. Claymore, when they witness him being brutally murdered with his head missing, just like his patients. Going to the surveillance room, they witness all the systems being broken and destroyed so that there's no evidence to who murdered the therapist. Having only one lead at this point, they visit Strong Fat's house, noticing that indeed he's the killer, having 4 boxes with 3 filled with the first 3 victims' heads, and the 4th being left for Dr. Claymore. Paul notices a pig doll on Strong Fat's bed, realizing that he sleeps with a stuffed doll since his childhood after looking at a picture of him holding the same doll as a kid. Pauline mentions that as all of this will go on record, they better refer to him with his real name, being no other than the terrifying and notorious Chris Walker, one of the main villains of the first game who relentlessly chased after Miles Upshur. Soon, Chris barges in with rage growing in his eyes, looking at his little stuffed doll, calling it Little Pig, then attacking both Pauls, a name that he was using to refer to his victims as well in the asylum. After a struggle for survival, the Pauls manage to incapacitate him and wait for Murkoff employees to come and collect him, in order to destroy any leads back to themselves. To close the case and any trace leading back to Murkoff, Pauls place Dr. Claymore's head in the last cooler box and take all of them to Omar Abdul Malik's apartment, pinning all of the murders on him. Paul, telling the story to the FBI agent, is visibly ashamed, saying that even the evidence of Omar being the killer was flimsy at best. His skin color and name did all the heavy lifting, who didn't even get a chance to defend himself, being discriminated against and thrown to jail falsely. The FBI agent then asks to why Paul would do such a thing if he's ashamed, when he reveals that he does it due to the privileges and benefits of Murkoff, giving his daughter Alice access to experimental treatments for her rare and incurable blood disease which his wife died from. Pauline, back to current time, explaining the story to the other Murkoff agents, explains unsympathetically how Omar was thrown into maximum security prison for life and how Chris Walker was sent to Mount Massive Asylum, where we know what happens to him. Pauline further explains that although she and Paul were labeled as partners, Paul in fact didn't know anything and didn't know about the horrid experiments carried out in both Mount Massive and Spindletop Clinic, with Mount Massive having more advanced technologies, and that Paul in fact was Pauline's target. Back to current time, Paul being in the FBI hospital, he refuses a necessary operation on his eye in fear of being assassinated before telling the whole story. On the other side, Pauline in Murkoff Rehabilitation Center explains the story of Wayland Park and how he got to Simon Peacock, the man who was standing in front of him when he was leaking the evidence to expose Murkoff. They both tell the story going back before the events of the first game took place, before Miles Upshur received the anonymous email of Wayland Park, and before he entered the asylum. An anonymous email about some unethical negligence practices is received internally to HR, which is quickly dismissed, with Murkoff, instead of fixing the problem, intending to get rid of whoever sent the anonymous email, quite possibly admitting them as a patient or shamed or slandered. Pauls begin their investigation to find out who sent the email, digging in deep, but failing to do so as the anonymous tipper covered their tracks pretty well. Pauline, having higher security clearance, goes deeper into the facility, observing the aftermaths of the experiments on Chris Walker, who has now become a mindless monster, who, as we know, was thrown into the morphogenic engine, sustaining discomfort about his skin on his face and becoming extremely vicious. There she meets Jeremy Blair, the man who admitted Wayland Park as a patient on the DLC, or Outlast whistleblower, introducing himself as Vice President of Global Project Development, the man behind many experiments who organized the Spindletop project, or in other words, the clinic whose patients were victims of the Hatbox murders. Blair then asks her why her partner Paul didn't join them, to which she explains that he doesn't have the same clearance, which makes Blair explain that he needs to understand that Murkoff weeds out employees who aren't true believers, while they force a patient into the morphogenic engine in front of them, displaying how they get rid of anyone who doesn't agree with their cruel practices. Pauline, going back to Paul, explains she didn't see anything abnormal, and then both decide to start with IT department, visiting a woman called Miss Haas. She explains that she's been pregnant for 6 months and directs them to Rick Traeger, the head of corporate, who would probably have a better clue. Traeger, as known from the first game, is also an admitted patient who performs gruesome live experiments on inmates, who was used as a test subject himself after being released from his position from Murkoff. Here, we learn why he was let go of. Meeting Traeger, he comes across as a sleazy and arrogant individual who blatantly clarifies that he always had intimacy with his employees, whom he fired quite often. Noticing that he wouldn't give up any information, trying to act smart, Pauline tricks him into a date, knowing what an out-of-control man he is, so that she can snoop around and find some sort of evidence of finding the culprit of sending the email. After a slow and agonizing night with Traeger, he takes Pauline back to his place, who spikes her drink and tries to roofie her. Pauline, being sharp and quick, notices the strange aftertaste and reacts quickly, making Traeger finish her drink, who falls asleep. Pauline then continues to collect some evidence, his internet password and an abortion clinic pamphlet, noticing it traces back to Miss Haas, who was 6 months pregnant. Going back to her house and confronting her, she explains that she was forced into the intimacy with Traeger, just like all the other female employees in his department, threatening every employee that they would get fired if they tell anyone. Traeger even pressures her into aborting her baby, which led her to make the decision to want Traeger to get fired as he abused his position and power. Sometimes later, in the Murkoff Human Resources, Miss Michelle Haas agrees on a severance package, keeping silent and keeping her baby in return of Traeger and herself getting fired. That's when an angered Traeger comes to the HR room and stabs Michelle with a pair of scissors in her stomach to get rid of any evidence of him ever being the father. That's when Paul incapacitates Traeger, with his hair getting stuck in the shredder machine. They subsequently admit Traeger as a patient and perform the morphogenic engine experiments on him. That's how he ended up in the asylum, being present as a villain in the first game. Later on, admitting Michelle to a real hospital and stabilizing her, they noticed that she never was pregnant and the symptoms she had were due to psychosomatic pregnancy, or also known as phantom pregnancy. A common problem 1 in 3 women working in Mount Massive experienced as side effects of the morphogenic engine in the basement. Talking to Blair, he informs both Pauls that they decided to transport all female employees to other facilities to avoid any future lawsuits. He then mentions a security clearance code which Paul Marion doesn't know, so he leaves Pauline and Jeremy Blair to discuss the astronomical projected profits from the Wall Rider project. The project that experimented on many patients, causing long-term trauma witnessed in the first game and its DLC. This wraps up the backstory of the first game and Whistleblower and the events that took place behind the curtains. The next 2 comics explain the events that took place after, leading up to the second game, explaining a lot of the plot holes. That's it for today's video, folks. If you enjoyed it, make sure to stay tuned for the other comics of Outlast to be explained. It's been your host Star, and I will see you on the next one.